So the latest update brought a lot of new mods that have people scratching their heads on where they should use them. And if you watched my video just before this one, you already know how effective they are on Ultimate Freyna now that she's out. But what I saw a lot of people asking afterwards is whether they have a place on Bunny. The answer is, oh yes they do. In fact, Zero Crit Bunny is now the best option available on every Bunny build. And once again, anyone telling you to run crit on her has not even tried to work out the math. And we're going to talk about why, along with the math to back it up on a couple different builds. So let's talk about what we're using, along with why we're using it, starting with the farming build, as that is what the overwhelming majority of people are going to be here for. Though keep in mind there are some different options that you can use here, and we'll talk about that. For general survivability, we're using increased HP along with Spear and Shield, nothing too crazy there. And then to boost our damage on power ratios, we have Spear and Shield again tying in, along with Focus on Electric, and then the new mod Electric Amplification, which some of you might question me on, but give me a bit and I will explain. Boosting our damage further still with skill power modifiers, we're using Focus on Singular along with another new mod, Singular Amplification, which is another one that people might think is scary, but again, just give me a moment. Skill Expansion and Maximize Range are obviously just there to give you a huge area of effect on your lightning emission. Maximize Conservation and MP Collector are there so you can maintain better uptime on your speed of light, which is something I have really come to appreciate in dungeons or invasions where they have long stretches of the dungeon where there's just no enemies to get your MP back with MP Collector. But I will say in the 400% dungeons where enemies just flood the fucking screen, you can live without conservation and put on another mod of your preference. You can put in more HP if you want, but Nimble Fingers is actually a decent choice to help with your roll cooldown, as rolling can be as fast as sprinting sometimes, but only if you have the cooldown to allow for it. For the ability augment, I personally prefer to use High Voltage, but it isn't required, and you can run other things if you are, like, say, an electric condense fetishist. High Voltage removes the standard AoE ring provided by her third ability and restricts the target's hit to just 3 maximum, but it increases the range and damage of the skill itself, and in most cases that is just hands down going to be the best option. More range, more damage, that's always good. However, there can be scenarios where there are so many enemies that it would be advantageous to remove High Voltage. Not even to use another Transcendent mod really, but just to get the AoE ring back that lets you hit an infinite amount of targets so long as they are within your AoE ring. I am not going to try and tell you when or where this swap should happen, because I honestly think it's just going to boil down to personal preference and your own playstyles. I only want you to be aware of the benefit of switching off that mod sometimes. For your reactor, you're obviously just going to be rocking an Electric Singularity reactor. Once again, if you aren't sure about reactor choices, go watch my vid on reactors and skill power for a much better idea of what you should be going for there. But for your subs, you want a Singularity power ratio as your target roll, and if that's the only one you get, that's totally fine, because your secondary roll is kind of whatever. You're not going to be running crit anymore, so crit rolls won't do anything for you here. So it's going to boil down to whatever you end up getting that is usable, and stats I would consider to be usable as your secondary rolls would be electric power ratio, skill cost, and then range in that order of priority. For components, as usual guys, it has got to be Slayer. I see way too many people preaching for Supernova on farming, but holy shit, that set his ass. We kind of talked about that in the first Bunny video I made, but the long and short of it is, even with the special secondary shock effect provided by Supernova, Slayer still beats it out in total damage and doesn't need to wait for a secondary shock to deal its full damage. If you have nothing else, yeah, Supernova is fine. Don't misunderstand. But in terms of the best in slot options, it's the Slayer set. The base power ratio bonus provided there is just way too fucking invaluable given how few sources of base ratio we can manage. Your component subs are kind of whatever. The most important is just going to be the sensor. Just try to get max MP and MP recovery in combat, and that will greatly extend your uptime on speed of light. The weapon you use during all this is going to be completely irrelevant. On crit builds in the past, you had the option of using Blue Beetle to increase your crit rate, but since the increase was multiplicative against your base rate of just 10%, it barely did anything for you, so you're not missing anything there. Use whatever weapon you get a reactor for, and you're going to be just fine. Lastly, in terms of her abilities, functionally, she has not changed since I first covered her. Her electricity bar still acts as a 2.3 times total damage multiplier when full, separate from your skill power, which is nuts, though it still doesn't reach the 2.5 times that the description implies it would. And then grappling still does the weird shit where emission procs way more often than it should in the middle of a swing. Now for the meat of our discussion. To crit or not to crit, and there will be a bit to this. What you see on screen right now is a crit build with a singular crit damage reactor, and to explain the ground rules on this comparison, I've set the crit resistance to just 5%. And if you don't know about crit resistance, please go watch my video covering that, but it's just there because we know every enemy in the game has at least 5% crit res. So we're we're just going to assume the lowest possible. And then the DR values modifying the damage numbers you see are just Devourer's DR, but since that's a multiplier, it doesn't actually matter here. The only reason we're showing Devourer's damage reduction numbers is because we will use Devourer as an example later. With that explained though, you can see the total average damage from lightning emission, including the shock per hit, as well as the damage over time, in the full duration of a single speed of light cast right up until the moment you run out of MP, is about 11.3 million damage, with the damage per hit values as shown. Damage here is great, there's nothing wrong with it, but now let's look at the critless build. And under the same circumstances, with the same duration, same total hits, etc., the total average actually comes out a little bit less at 10.3 million, and some of you are going to be confused with that, given that I still say critless is better. And the main takeaway here is that this is a farming build, guys. So the better comparison to make here is not average damage overall, but the damage per hit values instead. Trash mobs in dungeons are most often going to be eliminated with a single shock, and tankier mobs will be dead in 2. And in a world where trash mobs will be taking a single hit from you, you want the lowest possible damage that you deal to them to be very high. And on the crit build, the lowest hit in these conditions on a non-crit is going to be 138,000 damage, whereas on the critless build, you're rocking 246,000 damage. And that damage is guaranteed since we don't have crit on this build anymore. In a pure numbers perspective, the crit build looks better at 5% crit resist simply because the occasional crit damage drags the total average to be a little bit higher. But it's not even that much higher, and the consistency of having almost double the fucking damage per shock is going to be way more effective on farming builds. And real quick, to address another argument people might bring to the table in favor of the crit build, it could technically perform better on the bosses once you reach them, but I don't think that's true. Trash mobs have a 5% crit resist, yeah, but who said that commanders and dungeon bosses do too? I'd bet money they have more than 5, and once you start getting higher on the crit resist, the crit build's theoretical average lead gets smaller and smaller. And on a boss even, just so I don't have to circle back to this later, bosses have between 20 and 25% or more skill crit resist. And if we restore the crit resist value to what Devourer actually has, at that point the crit build is just flat out worse. Not even theoretical numbers can try to save it anymore. Again, like the Freynavid, this is not to say that building for crit is bad on every character, because that's not true. But for Bunny, you are straight up trolling yourself if you build for crit after this update, be it for mobbing or bosses. And on that note, really quick, because I'm fucking tired of speaking as much as I have lately, let's talk about the boss build. High voltage is definitely the go-to in terms of damage, forgive me, electric condense fetishists, but it just doesn't have a place here. Never use condense for boss fights. A quirky alternative is the shield transcendent mod, depending on the fight and whether you need more survivability, but that is technically a decent option. Ambush is there for obvious reasons. We're only running one range mod because it is more than enough when it comes to bosses, and then maximize conservation is a flex slot. For that one in particular, I personally prefer it and the longer uptime on speed of light that it can provide, but between grappling, rolling, and shooting, it is not pivotal to bring here. I personally prefer to run double HP mods like I show here, but depending on your situation, you can also swap out one or both of them to suit your needs. Don't hesitate to do so. Components would be identical to the mobbing build, but the reactor would be a Colossus Singularity roll instead. And then that's it. These mods are a gigantic upgrade to Bunny, and I'm loving them. I have one more video I want to make using these mods, and then I'll go back to working on new characters again. But the Bunny math is already on my website, though the UI section is old because she is one of the first characters I added on there. So I'll be updating the visuals on her section, but the new mods are not up on the website. That will be bundled with the update that adds the Freyna calculations in a day or two. So if you're wanting to see the math on your own custom Bunny builds using these mods, just wait a bit, and after I update the site, you will be able to do so.